you everyone for attending, and I'm in fact very glad to make this exposition. That's strange because I don't like to make presentations, but in fact I'm very glad in this time. Well, this is a joint work with Luis. This is a paper that was around, we were working in this around a year, more, in other projects, of course. Well, that's the idea, and we are talking about Curries paradox and possible para-consistent solution to the paradox. Well, first, a brief introduction about what is the discussion involved here is that we are in the discussion of enclosure scheme of Priest. In that, this scheme is interesting because it can characterize all the usual self-referential paradoxes like Russell's, Layers, and Raleigh-Fortis. It's more or less easy to check that all these paradoxes fall or are instances of the enclosure scheme. Well, that's the idea. Well, also using the enclosure schemes, Priest defends a beautiful principle, the principle of uniform solution, that says that if two paradoxes are of the same kind, it's reasonable to expect that have the same kind of solution. And this is more or less the slogan. Same kind of paradox, same kind of solution. Well, and maybe as you can expect, the uniform solution of Priest is adopting a parallel consistent logic as the underlying logic of our theories. Okay, but there are problems with Curries paradox. Why? Because, well, I will show why, but the idea is that the conclusion of the enclosure scheme paradoxes are contradictions. And as you know, Curries paradox conclusion is not contradiction, necessarily. Well, and we showed this little problem in this dilemma. Either the enclosure scheme is not compressive enough because it can characterize Curries paradox, or the principle of uniform solution is false because adopting a para-consistent logic is not enough for solving Curries paradox. And Priest's response is that Curries paradox belongs to a different kind of paradoxes, since there are no negation involved and the conclusion is not a contradiction. In general, that's more or less problems with Curries paradox problems with Curries paradox because, first of all, there are no negation involved in it, and we conclude triviality without using the explosion principle. Okay. Plights is in this discussion. Martin Plights proposed that, in fact, the Curries paradox belongs to the same family as the other paradoxes, and for that proposed a scheme, the Curries scheme, of which the enclosure scheme is a particular case. And from that, you can know that it can show that all the paradoxes accomplish to the Curries scheme as Curries paradox. So all the paradoxes are covered in this case. And Plights also criticized Priest that if we want to adopt a solution as change the logic of our underlying theory, we have to adopt a para-consistent logic that also invalidate contraction rule, contraction principle, but it is doubtful where this solution can count as uniform, because some of the paradoxes are solving but para-consistent properties, And Curries paradox are solving because it's not contracting the logic. And that's strange to say that that's a uniform solution. No? Well, we will present new reasons to believe that Curries paradox belongs to the same family as other self-referential paradoxes. And for that, we will use a very special notion of negation that Guillermo, that is not here, what Guillermo talked about that notion briefly, I suppose, the last Monday. And, but we will not follow plights in considering the doubtful that there is a uniform solution for paradoxes. In fact, we will defend some kind of paraconsistent solution to, that there are some kind of paraconsistent solution to the paradoxes. This is more or less the plan. Before I begin, I want to expose these provisos. First of all, we are not discussing the principle of uniform solution. It's, as I talked with Dave yesterday, it's not clear that blocking a paradoxes involves a solution to the paradoxes, but we are supposing for the sake of the argument, that the principle of uniform solution is correct. And we are not defending a particular solution to the paradoxes, not even the paraconsistent that is involved here. We just defend that if paraconsistent solution is a good solution, our proposal is a good solution too, and vice versa. And we're not discussing if the enclosure scheme can capture all the paradoxes. Because there are problems with Hinian libers that doesn't involve logical vocabulary or Grecian paradox, because that is involved more or less extensional axiom of set theory, extensionality axiom for set theory. So, if that's clear, we continue. Well, this is more or less the plan. Briefly, the two first sections are briefly just exposing what is inclusionary schema and the principle of uniform solution, the plights, criticisms to the inclusionary scheme, and the last sections are consideration of our proposal. Okay. Well, we begin. Briefly, this is inclusionary solution, the inclusionary scheme. Excuse. We consider two properties and a function, and that satisfy the following conditions. First, existence. There exists a set of all the things that satisfy the first property, and that set satisfies the second property. And transcendence. The second is that all the subsets of that set, the result of applying delta function doesn't belong to the subset itself. And by closure, we have that the result of applying delta to a subset, that result in fact belongs to omega, to the first set. And the idea is simple. If applying closure and transcendence to omega itself, we can get the contradiction that the delta omega belongs to omega and delta omega doesn't belong to omega. And that's the contradiction we can arise from more or less, for more of the paradoxes, including Russell paradox, that is an example. Then in fact we get that delta sets, it will be Russell's set.
Sorry. I'm going to be confused. So, is delta a function of x?
Yes.
And where is x in there? In the set that belongs. Okay, so it's the set of things that belong. Okay.
Yes, it's the set of things that belongs to x that doesn't belong to itself. It's something like Russell's set according to X. Okay, and again, the principle of uniform solution is this slogan that says that same kind of paradoxes in same kind of solution. And again, Priest will be said that the solution considered is adopting a paraconsistent logic as the underlying of our semantical class theories or even set theories. Set theory. Okay, but even is this inclusionary scheme is a good characterization of all the self-referential paradox, it seems that cannot capture Curries paradox. And again, Curries paradox is interesting because you can get triviality without using explosion principle and don't use negation. And this triviality, well, the idea is that the conclusion can be all sentence that you want. So, briefly, Curries paradox, just for be clear what are you talking about. Curries paradox is begin with this kind of sentence. We can introduce, in fact, a truth predicate here and certain kind of self-referential device or something like that, but for simplicity, we will use this sentence. And we just need these two principles. Detachment of an operation conditional and a contraction rule that is called to absorption or something like that. And the reasoning is very simple. From this, separate the biconditional, and applying contraction, we get this, and from detachment, we can get whatever you want. Even Luis is not sitting in front of me. Okay. Again, is interesting Curries paradox because there are no negation, and there you don't need the explosion principle to get triviality. And we are thinking about this kind of explosion principle. This is important for the last part of the talk. Well, and briefly, what is the problem, in fact, with Curries paradox? That in order to look for a uniform solution, we don't know what is exactly the problem or what is exactly the inference rules. We have to refuse to solve all the paradoxes, including the Curries paradox, or even just Curries paradox, because detachment or contraction maybe will some kind of properties that we want of the conditional. I don't know, and the idea is that we don't know what of these inferences we have to refuse to get a uniform solution. And merely paraconsistent solutions doesn't work because there are no contradictions. Okay, again, the dilemma is, or even inclusionary scheme is not compressive enough for characterizing all the self-referential paradoxes, because in Curries paradox is very similar, at least, I think, to Liar's paradox, for example, in the reasoning and in the formulation of this kind of sentence. And we want, if the inclusionary scheme is promising us to capture the self-referential paradoxes, we will expect that Curries will be there, no? Or principle of uniform solution is false, because adopting a paraconsistent logic would not help in solving Curries paradox. Okay. More or less, this is the response of Priest. Is that Curries paradox belongs to a different family of paradoxes, and that is because negation is not involved, and all the principles using for deriving the contradictions in the usual paradoxes are valid except explosion, and for Curries paradox are not. In contradiction, Priest defend that the Curries paradox problem is contraction rule, for example, and it seems that explosion is not related to contraction or nothing like that. And so this is more or less the response to Priest to this dilemma. Okay, first of all, Plates presents for criticize the enclosure scheme, this new scheme. Curries scheme is the same as enclosure scheme, except in the condition 2. We just substitute this formula in the consequent of this conditional and using this other. Where P will be an arbitrary formula. Okay, and that is what is explained here. We just substitute this from this, and we get P's pisciness substituting transcendence. And P's pisciness can be seen as a general version of transcendence, or transcendence as a particular case of the P's pisciness, considering this definition of negation. Because if you put bottom here, we can define negation in that way, and we get transcendence. Yeah? That's more or less the idea. Okay, and the conclusion of Plate's criticism is that Curries paradox belongs, first of all, for the same family of paradoxes because Curries scheme can satisfy all, well, can characterize all the paradoxes that enclosure scheme can characterize, and plus Curries scheme. But again, Plate says that if we want to change the logic in order to solve the paradoxes, we have to use a paraconsistent logic that not validate contraction. And again, it sounds like not uniform. Again, because all the paradoxes will be solved in a paraconsistent way, and the other in contraction way. For this not contracted, the logic. Okay. Our proposal is, first of all, that yes, Curries paradox belongs to the same family as other self-referential paradoxes. And from that, we're using some notions of Abelian logic that, again, Guillermo's Varia talked about the last Monday. Okay. And from this, we will hold that the negation, in fact, is involved in the paradoxes. Notice that this is different from Plate's ideas, because Plate says that in all the paradoxes of self-referential that conclude in a contradiction, in fact, there are some kind of conditional involved. Here, we are defending that, in fact, there is a negation, too. Okay, briefly, Abelian logic is the system obtained from the relevant system R, well, without contraction, that produce the system RW, and from RW we substitute double negation axiom from what Mayer and Slaney call the relativity axiom. And notice that the relativity axiom is very close to double negation axiom, because using, again, this definition, the classical definition of negation, and substituting B from top or bottom, we get that the double negation axiom in classical logic is a particular case of the relativity axiom. And from this, produce that the negation in A is a general notion of negation that say that a formula is negated relative to another formula, whatever you want. And I like the justification that the Mayer and Slaney gives. It's beautiful, I guess. The idea is that, again, from this definition of negation, we can think that the idea is that a negation of a sentence is true when that sentence implies a falsehood. And the idea is, from Mayer and Slaney, is that logic would not say, told us what propositions are false. No? And from that, we can consider that all propositions can play the role of the falsehood in a definition of a negation. And that's the idea from the generalized negation. Okay. And using this negation, you can imagine that this will help to reconstruct the reasoning behind Curries paradox, and to show that, in fact, there is an application of explosion principle, of some kind of explosion principle. And in the original reasoning, we just have to replace all the conditionals of the form C implies B from the correspondence negation. And we get this reasoning. Yeah. And from this reasoning, it's just the important thing that we have to notice here is that the steps 3 and 4 involve a contradiction, or some kind of contradiction using this negation, generalized negation. And 3 and 4 implies B in some kind of explosive way. Okay, generalizing paraconsistency. Okay, again, we believe that, in fact, there can be a uniform solution, a uniform paraconsistent solution to the self-referential paradoxes, including Curries. We believe that we can generalize paraconsistent in not just in a formal way, but too in a, we will say, conceptual way. There are more relation in a conceptual level between the rules involved in Curries paradox and explosion principle, for example. And the idea is, taking generalized negation, it is possible to show that detachment will be some kind of general explosion principle. So remember detachment in this formulation. We can substitute this conditional for the corresponding negation, and we get this kind of general explosion principle. And so, again, okay, before. And contraction can be translated a general Clavius rule. I don't know, we have another name. I know this rule as Clavius rule. And it is interesting because it can be shown that contraction, in fact, is involved in some kind of paraconsistent way with yeah, in the yes, contraction is involved in a paraconsistent way, not as Plights thinks. Plights says that no contracted logic and paraconsistent logic will be not be with no formulate a good notion of uniform solution. And from this, we can see that Clavius' rule show that contraction is in fact related to the paraconsistency, because there are negation involved here, and more or less the idea is that if okay, let's continue to see what is the idea. Well, more or less this is the reasoning at the end. And notice that we just using generalized Clavius rule and general explosion principle, we can get a triviality in using negation and explosion principles, and we can block explosion principle, these general explosion principles, to get a paraconsistent solution to the paradoxes. Okay, so a possible uniform solution to paradoxes consists just in restrict detachment, which is an important principle in Curries. And just for last note, notice that this uniform solution have same kind of ideas that had Gutschief in his article of 1996. Just until I notice, Gutschief doesn't defend that Curries paradox is in the negation is involved in Curries paradox. Maybe it's that the original part of this paper. Okay.
You have about,
yes.
I was about to say 30,
yes.
30 minutes.
Yes. As I noticed that.
You shouldn't talk about interesting things if you want me to look at the clock.
Okay, well, this is more or less the idea. And finally, we are considering maybe objections to these ideas. And first of all, someone could say that relative negation or generalized negation is not a negation, because in fact it's a condition. No? And the idea is that negation and conditional are quite different connectives. And this system of this notion of negation are confusing these two connectives. No? Well, here, first look at the two tables of the conditional in classic logic. In fact, there are not just difference between negation and conditional in classical logic, just are eliminated some possibles from that top is false. From in fact is behaving the same. The relative negation in fact can satisfy some of the properties of usually expected from negation. My favorite is this. Where is this? In a conceptual level, what is doing Abelian negation is some kind of, yes, in fact is switching from the count of the positive values from the false values and generate an excluded middle principle. But it validates all of this, and non-contradiction principle is validated in A. Implosion, dedualize, and negation and disjunction. It validates contraposition and double negation. And more than a technicality here, I think it is show that this notion of negation have some kind of behavior of negation. In fact, it's not just a confusing of connectives, but in fact is generating a real notion of negation from this. Again, my favorite is split middle, because yes, it's my favorite. I like it because
Let me ask you a question.
yes,
So some of the things up here require that we've embraced abelian things, and some of them don't. Like
yes.
excluded middle is, or relative excluded middle is true, right?
Mhm.
And double negation really requires that, right? So do you know, have a handle on which ones presuppose abelian maxims and which don't?
Maxims.
Like abelian principles
Which are the main principles?
that generalized double negation elimination.
Yes.
Contraposition is just prefixing 3 of the 4 De Morgans should go through without the 4th needs abelian stuff.
Okay.
Non-contradiction is pseudomodus ponens,
Yes.
which, are you sure non-contradiction holds? in abelian logic?
I think it does.
Okay,
At least, well,
because pseudomodus ponens I wouldn't have expected to hold in a contraction-free logic.
yes, that's truth. Okay. What I check, what I'm sure, is that this is not a theorem. That's what I'm sure. But you
Okay,
are
well,
right.
that's not surprising. This is a much more
Yes.
striking.
Yes.
And why does excluded middle?
What? What?
Why does excluded middle hold?
What?
Yeah. I just
Well,
don't see.
my idea on my briefly proof is that using characterization theorem from A and evaluating the usual interpretation that C gives to A. And from that, this will be zero leaf alpha using the canonical negation.
Well, but that doesn't make a claim for a canonical negation, that makes a claim for a generalized
Yes,
negation.
of course. But
It's
From
that
our
holds classically for any
understanding
gamma,
here.
right?
What?
That holds classically for any gamma.
Sure, but we're in dealing logic,
yes,
we don't have contraction.
Or,
yes. Okay, as I understand the characterization theorem, it can be shown that using the interpretation and the canonical negation, you can prove something in C and invalidate non-abelian groups.
Oh, John, I'm not questioning whether that holds for the canonical negation, I'm questioning the claim on the slide,
On the slide.
right, which says that it holds for.
Okay, maybe I'm just
Okay.
confused because what I understand from the kind of characterization theorem is that in this model of C, you have to use canonical negation, or you can use canonical negation.
So what do you
For
mean
working
by,
with that.
what do you mean by not sub gamma then, on this slide?
Yes.
I thought you just meant the conditional thing that you had been using
Yes.
for an arbitrary gamma.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. And the idea is that in the characterization theorem, you can get that these two maybe collapse or something have a similar behavior. Again, I'm not sure.
With gamma as arbitrary?
Yes.
Okay, no, that just won't work, right? Because that involves the assumption that gamma always
Okay.
takes the value 0, but if it's meant to be arbitrary, of course,
Okay.
then it can be arbitrary.
That is exactly what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, that won't work.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, forget it. I lost my favorite. Thank you. Okay, but well, we have to check this, all of this. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, the second, I guess, it will be worse. the idea is that, for example, Priest says in a line that negation and conditional, in fact, not just different connectives, but two are different notions. In nature, different notions, because negation is extensional and implication has been intentional, in particular, have been strict implication. And so, this makes relative negation an illegitimate notion of negation, because are combining or interdefining some different notions. But what we respond is that, in fact, negation is intentional, as negation, as conditional is. And I think that more or less, well, who said that negation cannot be intentional, has not made and complaining really good reasons. We have to develop this more, or maybe a possible reaction to intentionality, extensionality of negation. But in fact, we think that negation is intentional.
Manuel,
Yes.
These priests claim, and I don't remember what he says, but I'm guessing that when he says that, he's talking about an intentional conditional involved.
Or
so define your generalized negation not using an extensional conditional, but instead an intentional. And then it will be.
It will works.
Let's talk about it after. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, what I'm looking at is that, for example, it's very related with what is the priest says that is the problem in Curries paradox. That contraction is the problem in Curries paradox, not the principle of explosion of detention or something like that. And for example, that's what he proposed in intentional or strict conditional. But in a line, at the end of 1994, it really says this, that some kind of this definition, it wouldn't work well, because these two are quite different notions.
But what is the conditional on the right?
Material. But in the explanation of that claim, he says that entailment is intentional. It's strict, he said clearly that. I wasn't noticed that Luis made me see it. I doesn't remember that. It's very short.
The claim in the very last lines of the paper is no, just negation is extensional because it just flip-flops the values, but the conditional is a different beast, is intentional. You have to go through other models to evaluate it.
No doubt, but if he's talking about the material condition.
So I've got it right in front of me. What he actually does is he says, let's consider a material and a non-material conditional. If it's the material conditional, this is just saying hold. If it's non-material, then otherwise. That's
Okay.
Okay, just for conclusions, it's a very brief summary. We have offered reasons to consider that Curries paradox belongs to the same family as other self-referential paradoxes. And in fact, that negation is involved in the reasoning of the Curries paradox. And maybe a possible uniform solution is using a generalized notion of explosion principle that is just detachment rule. And we are not claiming that this is the correct solution, just that, again, if paraconsistent solution is a good one, it will be. Okay. And that's all. Thank you.
Dave?
Yeah, I've got a few things, but let me just focus on one. Look, paying attention to polarity of context and the negativity of the antecedent and the conditional and so on, like this is great. I love this stuff. This is right up my alley. So I'm excited to see this. I'm excited to see this work, and I want to understand the details better. So you suggest that a uniform solution can be arrived at by that sort of getting rid of detachment is like getting rid of explosion.
Yes.
Sure, absolutely, that seems clear. That totally seems far more uniform, for example, than the sort of Priest-Weber kind of approach. Great.
Okay.
But you've developed this in the context of abelian logic.
Yes.
And abelian logic does obey detachment.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to reconcile these parts. So are you proposing a modification of abelian logic that does not detach?
No, in fact, this is at this point, it's just a using of a conceptual of some concepts of abelian logic. We are just talking negation and look and show that in fact this negation is involved in Curries paradox. In fact, maybe abelian logic doesn't work for solving paradox or solving some modifications. I don't know. It's nothing.
Okay, so maybe I maybe don't understand what the role of abelian logic is then, right? Because the antecedents of conditionals are negative flavors in. I mean, so double negation, elimination, and one of the four De Morgan laws will be special to abelian logic. But the other sorts of things you pointed to, right? That's usual. Any kind of condition will give you those. So is there like what is abelian logic doing for you here?
Just give us a notion.
Just gives you that kind of example. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's not kind of example because,
Yeah.
it in fact doesn't work for a solution or something like more substantial. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks. Maybe can you just put me on the end? Eduardo?
Some people, like JC and Julian Mursi, present in a paper a different paradox that is connected with Curry paradox, but it's validity paradox.
Yes.
And this paradox usually is connected with some superstructural principles. Maybe Dave is right, and maybe is transitivity, or maybe some people like Elias, this is contraction.
Yes.
The structure is relatively similar, that there are some connection between this paradox and the other one. But I suppose that the idea of JC was to introduce a motivation in order to point out that maybe another principles are in this kind of
Yes.
paradox. Are you consider that option? Because some people could believe that in the derivation that you show, implicitly, there are some superstructural principles that are working.
Yes. I will say no.
But
I checked the idea.
Yeah, it's a possibility. In order, because your concern is about to have only one solution to all paradoxes that are connected. So even if you are right about Curry, another concern is about validity current.
Yes. Yes. What I say now, because before I think in this, is that maybe it helps to show what is the kind of properties that can satisfy a operator to generate Curries. Maybe. But that's all that I can say. I don't consider so structural possibilities to that. In fact, I'm not thought very much in this. That's all that I maybe think about it.
Good. Well,
In my presentation, I connect classical logic with LP, yes. And maybe it's clear, we are completely agree about that there is a connection about modus ponens or detachment, fight.
Yes.
And you're completely right, but in that picture, the work is doing by Cat.
It seems like.
And Cat is the main responsible about the failures of explosion and metamodus ponens. And maybe it's another connection between both projects.
Yes. Okay. Yes. It will. In fact, I think that an important property of the relation, at least of structural rules and conditional, is very much doing by. The work is very close to doing by transitivity, but again, this is just speculations. But I know.
Oh, no, I thought you were going to continue.
Yes. But I know the idea. But I don't know if from this we can get more information from, for example, the validity and Curries. I don't know.
Just to follow up on that discussion, I should advertise that there's a new version of Curries Paradox in the Stanford Encyclopedia article, and it's really, really good. And the goodness is entirely due to my colleague Manuel Shapiro, whom I asked to co-author the new version with, and so we wanted to scrap the early version and just do it fresh. And the new version sort of tries to take a slightly more abstract picture of what's going on, and we define a Curry connective in ways that you have, and look at the properties that can have. This will only help your project. I'm not saying it, so your project is I think in line with the new version. But again, even though I'm a co-author, all praise to Lionel for the goodness. If there's badness, it's truly due to me. All right, David. Thomas. Sorry. No, he's on the back of the. He's on the back of the queue. Yeah.
Well, that's fine. So really quick comment, just because I looked up the Abelian paper, and Abelian logic, right, relative to the middle isn't valid. Okay. Yes. I have a question. I've been thinking about Abelian logic a little bit. I've been talking about Guillermo about this before we came here. And one of the things that sort of always struck me as strange was there's a sort of lack of duality with generalized double negation introduction and elimination, right? Because generalized double negation elimination is valid in classical logic. Just since you've been thinking about Abelian logic, I was wondering if you might have any thoughts on that. Why? I mean, I recognize. If you look at double negation elimination generalized, right? It's just like most opponents or syllogism or something like this, right? But in general, why that? If you have any idea of why that sort of asymmetry would be present?
I don't know. I'm not as familiar with Abelian logic. In fact, it's just using the concepts and trying to understand what is happening there.
Yeah.
It's just the abbreviation.
Dave has a follow-up.
Yeah, I think the answer has got to be somewhere in the following area. It's because these conditionals are essentially sub-intuitionistic. And you've got that asymmetry already in intuition.
Yeah, so one of the things
negation,
that I do know is if you take like material co-implication, the opposite.
Yep.
You have introduction, but not elimination.
Here is where you have introduction, but not elimination.
I'm sorry, you have elimination and not sorry.
But no, I think that's the asymmetry.
It's the asymmetry. Thanks both.
Thanks.
Dave?
Oh yeah, I wanted to call attention to something that went by pretty fast, but that I think is pretty exciting. Let me maybe try to sell you an aspect of your talk that you didn't. And so this is to do with the negation principle that you identified with contraction. You had a name for it. It's not a principle that I have any name for, so I've forgotten the name you had for it. But Clavius principle, right? That principle. I mean, that's, so you said at the time as you were presenting it that, see, this is another connection to paraconsistency.
Yes.
But that struck me as odd because, right, that's a principle that's typically rejected on paracomplete approaches,
Yes,
not on paraconsistent approaches. And there is at least I have a sense, and I find it very hard to articulate, but I don't think I'm the only one in this boat. There's a sense in which non-contractive approaches do kind of sit better, more uniformly, nicer on the paracomplete side of the street than they do on the paraconsistent side of the street, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about like priest view and fields view, the disuniformity feels much more striking on priest side. And I don't know why that is or something, but you may have some resources to articulate why that is. Precisely centering around this kind of principle,
Yes.
right? Which is, it's okay, it's just reductio, but also it's contraction, right? And I mean, it strikes me that there's potential there to explain something that it would be nice to have a better explanation of.
Okay, just for clarity, the comment, that's discussion that I have with other classmates, and he's not here. It's awful. Poor Sam. We think that this describes some kind of behavior of the contradictions. We never develop, but that's more or less the idea.
Okay, what does that mean?
That for works negation to work with contradictions, more or less, they have to kind of explosive behavior, because he thinks that this, in some sense, implies that in some sense, implies that alpha is absurd. That's what he thinks about this. Because if alpha is implying his negation. That more or less the idea is not developed, but that's the idea behind this.
Okay, I don't understand.
Yes, excuse me, very vague.
You're not endorsing this,
No.
right? You're just saying that this is another way to look at contraction, right?
Yes. Yes, it is not defending in the paper. It's not. In fact, this is new. It's just a few days ago that it's involved.
But if you don't endorse this, why reject detachment or explosion? Right? I mean, you can't get yourself, if you don't have this, you can't get the ingredients for the detachment.
I don't get that.
I mean, this is always right. This is the usual paracomplete, paraconsistent thing, right? If you don't have excluded
Yes.
middle, well, you won't find yourself with a contradiction, so no problem. Similarly here, but if you don't have contraction, you won't get the ingredients for a modus ponens.
Okay. Why reject contraction? The modus ponens and not reject this, for example. That's what you're saying.
Well, I mean, if you're saying you're not assuming this, then the proof already breaks at this
Yes.
step, which just comes before the other step.
Okay. I don't know. You have an idea?
Luis?
Yeah, probably yesterday you had the idea that this fits somehow in the paraconsistent picture.
Yes.
Because he told me something like, look, this is just a version of or a form of explosion. So,
But this is not a form of explosion at all.
Again, this is
it is not. Yeah. that was the kind of claim Manuel was telling me. So it can fit in the para-consistent picture too, not necessarily just para-complete. You can give some para-consistent reasons to reject that, and that's true. Then you don't get the ingredients for attachment. But
What would be a para-consistent reason to reject that?
I don't know.
Well, there's a.
It's an instance of
yes,
modern
yes,
development.
No, I was thinking if you really abstract away from the idea of explosion as, so if you think of it as, I'm not endorsing this, but what I thought maybe Manuel was thinking is, think of it as if alpha's true, then if alpha's false in this sense,
Yeah, that's the idea that I want to expose to.
then alpha, it's more like a reductio sort of, in as much as a reductio is broadly related to explosion, then there's a relation. So I think you need to think about the relationship between explosion and reductio.
And I would then this form of reductio, right, is very easy for a para-consistentist to accept, right? It's usual for para-consistentists to accept it. This is the version para-completists reject, right? They say just because it implies its own negation doesn't mean its negation is true.
Yeah.
Right, sure, if either it or its negation were true, its negation would have to be, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
From this, maybe just why modus ponens? Because we have para-consistent reasons for related. From this we have to work on this.
Yeah. Yes.
There is an important update of Graham in the Australasian Journal of Logic about the Gucci project that is directly connected with the topic. And the connection, the clear connection, obviously the paper talk about the Curries paradox, but the clear connection is how Graham now is analyzing the Gucci project. So we introduce the Gucci and present two different options, and the options are or you abandon modus ponens, or you abandon modus ponens, or you abandon contraction in order to get a solution.
Yes, that's what.
People in Buenos Aires have a paper where we introduce another option. The other option is to take the conditional of they and use in the way to produce a reference and abandon cat in the meta-inferential level. So maybe it's another option to take in consideration here.
Yeah, thank you.
But it would be a sort of modification to the first line of just rejecting attachment. It would be in that line. Right?
Well, the idea.
Now it's validity that doesn't detach.
Yeah. This is the project, something like that.
Lavinia?
Well, I'm not sure, but maybe it's because you just said that that's some kind of explosion, and I'm not sure what you mean exactly, but I thought maybe if we move the negation to the left, right, so we have alpha and alpha, the not alpha, like from that, we should get not alpha, right? If modus ponens held. So rejecting that inference could be a way of rejecting modus ponens, perhaps. Is that what you mean?
Not me.
Oh,
Manuel was telling me that, to be honest, I didn't think that much about this. But yeah, I think there are some ways in which we can make sense of this claim that it has some para-consistent flavor. That would be one, and JC suggested before, but at least for me, I have to think more about it.
For clarification, the idea that Samuel and I have is more close to what JC says. That if you suppose alpha is true, implies that alpha is false. More or less that's one.
It is important to remember. I think that there is a flavor of
Yes.
sort of an explosion there, but it is, as Dave said, I mean, typically, that sort of thing is more rejected by the pair complete. If we're keeping these as two distinct options, as Dave said, think of this sort of fieldish and priestish. Yeah. Lavinia?
No. But if weakening held and modus bonus held, then that will follow, right?
Why?
Well, I just add alpha on the left.
Well, yeah, but, okay, so that thing's valid, it's modus ponens, but weakening allows you to add premises, not take them away.
Sure, but, sorry, contraction. So, because of what I said before, right? So, that plus alpha on the right, on the left, is modus ponens, right?
Yes.
But if I can move the negation here, so let's start with alpha, then not alpha, then not alpha, right?
Oh, contraction on the right.
Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
totally. Yep.
So in a way it is, if modus ponens held and contraction, not weakened, sorry, held, then that would follow. So if that doesn't
Okay.
follow, you're either rejecting contraction or,
But contraction on the right, which is really weird in this context. Like if we're thinking relevantly, it's often unstable. And so it doesn't commit you to contracting on the left. Oh, this is
Yeah.
fun.
yeah, I was also thinking about second one.
Excuse me for the confusion, just
Sorry.
when I was posing a new idea. Thank you.
Is there anything else? Okay, please join me in thanking Manuel